Hi, everybody. This is Bill Vasquez, and this is another episode of Billboard Comics. I am still Sand Beard, but I'm here to talk to you about my golden age of comic books as part of the Growing Up Comic Books feature. Um, my golden age of comic books was either from 1983 to 1984 or 1984 to 1985. Now, if you have seen some of the installment of Girlfriend's Guide to Comics, where I talk about ages, where I say that the golden age of comic books lasted from 1935 to 1956. I got it right this time because there's no ducks around to distract me. You might be saying, what does it mean, your personal golden age? Um, there was a thing done by certain writers, I know Mark Evner mentioned it, where every collector has a golden age, and it's usually either when they turn 12 or turn 13. The idea behind it is that you are young and you're just maturing. You're leaving the childish stuff behind and becoming more mature. You're becoming a teenager. You're gaining maturity. You're growing. And any comic books during this period is kind of like where you start actually to understand more things about the comic books, about the art form, about what they're all about and what they entail. And um, you know, you are more like savvy and also, but still young enough to have the joy and enthusiasm to enjoy the comic books. So it's that sweet spot between like becoming like an adult and a child, where your enjoyment of comic books is at its peak. I've seen it when it. Some people like the age of 12 is the golden age for collectors, and I've seen other places that age is 13. Um, I will try to. I had an idea about doing this. To go through like the comic books at the time. I was 12 and 13, um, and find out how true this is. Not just personally, because like my personal um, golden age is like just not 1 year. It goes all the way back to when I like this whole feature. Growing up comics is dedicated to my golden age of comic books when I was younger and growing up and stuff like that. So it's I can't really narrow it down to just 1 year because I had really special moments all the way from like when I was 5 all the way up to now. Um, so it's big, rolling, gigantic golden age of comics for me. But using this maximum of 12 or 13, I want to see, first of all, were there any comic books during this time that I personally got a lot of joy and, and enjoyment out of? And also as a wider basis, is there a historical aspect where comic books that were um, published during this time also historically important? Um, is it something that had a lasting effect on the comic book industry, and also like expanded the boundaries of the genre and the um, hobby? So that's basically my thoughts going into this. I'm going to go through every month of the 1983, 1984, and 1985, from November of 1984, no, 1983, sorry, November 1983, when I turned 12. My birthday is November 2nd. I was born in 1971, so you do the math. All the way until the last day of my 13th year on this earth, which would be actually be November 1st, 1985. Um, but the spoiler warning, there were no really comic books that came out before I turned 14 that I could talk about in November 1985. And just go through everything. I'm not going to cover every single comic book that ever came out because I don't want this video to be 9,000 hours long. I have a hard time having people watch any of these videos. So, you know, expecting to sit down and do all that, it's not realistic. So, and I would never do that to you guys. But I'm going to try to be as brief as possible, but as comprehensive as possible. And just to go through. But hopefully now we know the how the game is played, and now you know what the parameters are, so we could go through this and discuss my golden years of comic books. I'm going to start off like by about like how it was going into November of 1983. What was going on that made the comic books great? At the time, John Byrne was writing and drawing not only Fantastic Four but also Alpha Flight, one of my favorite creators of all time. Um, Marv Wolfman and George Perez were partnered on New Teen Titans over at DC. Another historic pairing of artist and writer on and title. Um, Howard Chaykin was active doing his seminal work, American Flag. He was finishing up, I believe, the first arc of the series. Walt Simonson was on Thor. He had just did a whole revamp of that, and he was like working his way through that. Um, Chris Claremont was recently paired with John Romita Jr. on the Young X-Men. So there was already great work already around and available to be perused by young 11, 12-year-old me. Um, but things really started to pick up around November 1983. First off, we had Batman number 368. This is the first appearance of Jason Todd in costume as Robin. It also arrived in the same month as Dick Grayson gave up the Robin identity in New Teen Titans. But that's New Teen Titans. I don't know what number it was, um, but it was the same month, like maybe just because a couple weeks later or stuff like this. Um, this to me as a kid was a big deal. Robin was the first sidekick there was, and from 1940, I believe he came in, all the way until to 1982, he was the Robin. Um, and like there's a lot of time that he was actually at Batman's side and working with him and doing stuff like this, while having solo adventures in like say Star Spangled Comics and a whole bunch of other features like that. During the 70s, he kind of like went to college and had solo adventures separate from Batman, and Batman had his own solo adventures there. So they kind of like were growing apart. And by the time 1982 ran around, um, they were kind of like spending a lot of time as being separate heroes. But the powers that be decided like he probably needed another Robin, but having Dick Grayson go back there would be kind of like backsliding because he's become more mature and more of an adult. So they came up with Jason Todd. Um, and Jason Todd, for the first, like, say, couple of years of his life, like maybe 3 or 4 years, maybe 5 years, was basically like chipper, kind of like um, Dick Grayson with the serial numbers rubbed off, kind of character. Um, he was just basically a replacement Robin in every sense of the word. However, um, after Crisis on Infinite Earths, when stuff started getting a little bit more gritty and more dark, um, things started to change, especially after like Frank Miller and Dave Mazzucchelli did Batman Year One in his series. Uh, that kind of turned Robin into he became in Jim Starlin's run on the title. He became a kind of a hoodlum on the streets. Um, Before this, he was another like gymnast in a circus who kind of took up the identity. Um, but instead, he became a hoodlum on the streets. I think like the first time Batman meets him, he's stealing the hubcaps off the Batmobile or something like that. Um, as you might realize, this kind of change for the character uh, wasn't really well responded to by the audiences. They didn't like him that much. Um, so when DC Comics decided to have a call-in number, uh, Death in the Family, to see whether or not Robin would live, fully expecting Robin to totally live, and this is going to be like a big publicity stunt, the number of people who called in to request him dying outweighed the number of people who want to keep him around. So, into the grave, Jason Todd went. Eventually, Batman would get a new Robin and Tim Drake, and Jason Todd would be resurrected as the Red Hood, which he still is today. Um, and he also, Batman had another one with his son Damian Wayne. So Robin has changed hands a couple times. For a brief period, there was a female Robin in there. Um, but back before this, it was like it all started here, and was a big break from that, and it was a big deal at the time for me as a kid. I remember, so I was kind of hyped for that. Next up is Star Trek #1. Why am I putting on this here? Well, first of all, it's DC's first foray into the Star Trek license, one they would carry for a number of years. But it has a cover by um, George Perez on it. George Perez is one of my favorite artists of all time, and to have him on this cover drawing the Star Trek crew um, was really, really amazing. I don't know if he did the first issue of the Marvel version of it. I have to double check that. But here, it's a straight on forward of the movie accurate Star Trek crew, um, all done in George Perez's style. I like this a lot, and I recently got, thanks to my friend Rich Dries, shout out to Rich, um, got my hands on it. Um, but yeah, George Perez actually did the first 3 issues of this, but the other two, it was basically him doing ships, which to me is kind of like having like uh, Aaron Judge on your team and not allowing him to bat. Uh, but that's just me. I digress. Um, those both came out on November 10th. And I'm getting all these information from a Mike's Amazing World. He has a breakdown of when each week and each day that these comic books came out. So if your memories are different, you think they came out like earlier or sooner than this, or a different day, um, don't light me up. This is where I'm getting it from, and this is where he got it from. He's no longer with us. I don't know who is running the site now, who might be able to fix it, but just so you know, that's one of the things going on there. Next date was 11/15/1983, which is Cerebus the Aardvark number 56. This was seminal for a number of reasons. It was smack dab into the very important church and state arc uh, in the title. This is during one of its high points, when its glory days. Um, it would go on for another like 244 issues, so um, it still had a certain level of quality all the way through, but this is a high point for it. It also featured a character on it called Wolver Roach. They had a character in the comic book called Roach who basically was kind of a lunatic, but he'd be one week a parody of Moon Knight, and then one of Spider-Man. And one time he came as he was after this he was a parody of Sandman, Morpheus, the Neil Gaiman version of it. But during these 2 issues, this one I think and the one before it, he was mocking Wolverine from Marvel. Marvel did not take kindly to this, and they were not exactly the big fans of it. So, yeah, so it's important from that aspect. But for me personally, I think it's important because the backup feature was the first appearance of a character called Normal Man, and we'll talk about him more a little bit later on in the years. It was a character created by Jim Valentino when the original Image 7, about a person who was born on a planet first of like who exploded, and his parents put him into a rocket and sent him to this world, and he became the only non-superpowered person on this planet of superheroes, which is like kind of like that should tell you the kind of parody was in it. I thought it was very funny. It was very well done. I thought it was hilarious. He eventually have a series later. I'm going to get to that in a bit with like every cover another parody of another kind of like comic book cover. But it was one of the most inventive and imaginative series on out at the time, and it got to start here in the backup feature of this book. Next, we're going to go to the 17th, November 17th, 1983, with the biggest book of this month. We started off big, ladies and gentlemen, really big for my golden year. And of course, I missed this entirely. I didn't get this at all. This is Saga of the Swamp Thing, number 21. This was it wasn't Alan Moore's first work on Swamp Thing. That was number 20. But number 20 is basically devoted to him, like tying up loose ends from the previous writers and different plot lines and stuff like this. Just like cleaning house, putting everything away in its place before he could start like making his masterpiece. And his masterpiece started here with the anatomy lesson. Um, it's kind of hard to underplay exactly how important this issue is into comic book history. Just naming like about 3 or 4 things off the top of my head. It exposed more than anything else Alan Moore to American audiences, and he became one of the most popular writers during this time. From this and going into Watchmen, and they adapted Miracle Man, which we'll get to later on. Also, um, it also started a whole influx of British creators. You had artists like Jamie Delano and Neil Gaiman and Grant Morrison and Garth Ennis. It's like, I mean, UK version stuff like this that cracks open a day that a door that's open even to this very day, where you have like Kieran Gillen and I think Al Ewing is also British. You have a whole bunch of like that became another aspect of really good comic book writers to come into the United States and do this. Without this issue and it being so successful and so powerful, we probably wouldn't have had the Vertigo imprint, and we probably wouldn't have had like the Doom Morrison's Doom Patrol run or Delano's Morrison's and Delano's Animal Man run, or Peter Milligan, another British invader, doing Shade of Changing Man, or we would have Sandman, done by that guy who wrote it, who I've already mentioned his name, so I don't know why I'm not saying it now, Neil Gaiman. Uh, but yeah, we wouldn't have had that. Um, and we would have also had the grim and gritty destructionist phase, where people who grew up reading comic books decided to attack the comic book heroes with a different eye, a more critical eye, and try to dig in deep to what the characters are and take them in different directions, more realistic or more cynical or whatever. This is not really a 100% good thing either. I'm not saying like that your opinions might vary on all these stuff, but my opinion on this is like there's a lot of people who were doing the kind of like the deconstruction that didn't do quite as well as say Mr. Gaiman or Mr. Morrison or Mr. Moore did. They saw grim and gritty as being for the purpose of just being grim and gritty, and they had like a lot of hyper violence and occasional frontal nudity, and they thought they were being edgy and cool, not realizing that what Morrison and Moore were doing was there's more intelligence involved in that and more creativity and artwork going on that. But I digress. Um, Next up, we're going to go to December 1983. First up would be G.I. Joe, Real American Hero number 21. This is the famous silent issue. It was released on 12/6/1983. Um, this was one written by Larry Hama and drawn. I don't know who was drawn by, but like it was full. There's no dialogue in it. I think it was a battle between Storm Shadow and Snake Eyes, done completely without any dialogue. It's so popular and so um, part of the touchstone of comic book history that Image is now doing a whole month of one shots that are silence based on the legacy that this has left behind. Coming up in December 17th, we had A Team number 1. This is more of a personal landmark than a historical landmark, because I was a big fan of the A Team, and Marie Severin, I believe, was the artist on this, and just to see her version of these characters. I have a great respect for her brother, John Severin. John Severin was primarily working for Cracked at the time, and he was also doing parodies like this. And he had the unique ability to make everybody who drew based on a real person look like that person, but also keeping his style. You knew it was him drawing it, and he knew that who the character was. His Alan Alda looked like Alan Alda from MASH, but you could tell it was John Severin drawing it. Not a lot of people do that. A lot of people just like either their style overwhelms the actual look of the people, or they lose their style into the people. The only person I've come close to this kind of thing is his sister Marie, who did an excellent job on this series, and also Jerry Ordway, who's one of my favorites. When he did the Batman movie adaptation, you could tell it was Jerry Ordway drawing it, but Michael Keaton looked like Michael Keaton, Kim Basinger looked like Kim Basinger, and Jack Nicholson looked like Jack Nicholson. And I think that's a really good talent and skill to have. Um, Also came out this year, it was the second number one issue of the second Hercules miniseries. Um, Hercules miniseries were really, really fun. It was, I think, written and drawn by Bob Layton, and it, it dealt with him, I believe, in the future after he's in the moral, so he's like away from all his friends and stuff. He's pretty much all alone. He has a robot companion and a Skrull who he carries around with him all the time. Um, it was a nice mix of tone. It's not a mix of comedy, but seriousness in it, and it was one of my favorite series there. If you ever get a chance to check it out, either if you find it in the dollar bins, you see all four of them there, or I don't, there was some trade paperbacks that were made of it that are still around. You probably get them cheap. I know I got one uh, a year or two ago. That's like really, really not that expensive. Check it out. This is one of the things I recommend to you. Um, Also, uh, what came out, I believe, in the same day, was the Marvel Fumetti book. Um, this is a comic book that basically Fumetti, I believe, is an Italian form for comic books. It's the word for comic books in Italian. Um, don't quote me on that. I could be wrong on that, but I think that's what it is. But for the term of the American audience, it's a comic book basically made up of photographic images. Uh, they do scenes, still scenes, and progress from scene to scene, from photo to photo. Um, so this was one of those, but it's taking place in the Marvel bullpen. This is Marvel did this a lot in the '60s. They used to have like a club called the Mary Marvel Marching Society, and they used to do a record like 45 that they used to put out, and they'd have all the people from the um, which were called the uh, bullpen talking and do songs, and they talk and they sing and do stuff like this, and you'd be able to hear Jack Kirby be irascible and in the background of a lot of stuff. Yeah, so this is kind of like that. It's like a way of presenting the whole bullpen as a wacky, fun kind of um, like camaraderie kind of wacky kind of thing. Um, Although with like some modern sensibilities. One of the big running bags there is about having a wet t-shirt contest, and then try to get all the female staff members to get soaking wet so you could if you've been the concept behind red t-shirts. But it's kind of interesting. It's interesting for me at the time, because like you are able to see the industry, the people whose names, the faces behind the names. John Byrne was in it. Chris Claremont was in it. Louise Jones, which was the name at the time. Her name's now obviously Louise Simonson is in there. Um, and do stuff like pictures mostly done by Vinnie Coletta, one of the most notorious names in comic books, and also by Elliot R. Brown, one of the most underrated names of comic books. He usually did most of the technical breakdowns and designs and diagrams in the um, official Marvel handbook books. Um, and also you'd have like Art Adams doing like the special effects. Every so often people would bop somebody, you have like stuff like this. This was probably one of Art Adams' first work in comic books ever, at least one of his first works at Marvel, and he's basically saying "boom" when like Walt Simonson turns into Thor, and that kind of happens. But it's a fascinating kind of um, like example of the time and history, and put stuff there and be able to see how Marvel was back then. And you can actually read it on the Marvel Unlimited app, which I got some of the images from here off of. So, do yourself a favor and just check it out. Now, next up is December 20th, which would be, uh, let's see, here it is. Next up would be actually like the 25th, I believe, for 20th, 23rd, maybe 20. It was late in December. It is Infinity Inc. This was one of DC's foray into Baxter's series. Um, it was I think, a direct only release on higher quality paper. It was thicker, more sturdier, and with a wider sheen to it. It's easier, like a, it didn't seem to actually be like the kind of murky brownish gray that the newsstand print had. Um, this series, of course, is a legacy series. It deals with the children of the uh, Justice Society. By this time, the Justice Society has been around for decades, and even though they did um, do some in continuity things to make their longevity make more sense, they're still been around for you know decades and decades and decades, and you know obviously they're old enough to have children of their own, and this is their team and stuff like this. It was written by Roy Thomas and drawn by Jerry Ordway. Jerry Ordway was the artist on All Star Squadron, and he moved over to this. Um, there are a lot of teams that get like a lot better press in comic book history. Claremont Byrne, Wolfman Perez. I would put Thomas and Ordway right up there with a close third. Um, uh, their pairing was awesome. A perfect master of, especially on their Golden Age titles, because like obviously Roy Thomas is master, a expert on the Golden Age characters and a really good writer, but also Jerry Ordway's artwork seems to match this more clean, simple style that matched the era that it came from. Um, but it's a vast improvement. I mean, if you look at some of the uh, Golden Age comic books, and the artwork pales in comparison to the stuff today, but Jerry Ordway's artwork acts as kind of a bridge between the two. All right, let's move on to January 1984. Um, First one I'm going to choose came out on the 3rd. So after you're done with your New Year's Day festivities and took a day or two to rehab, go to your local comic store and find the generic comic book. Generic comic book basically is another comic book that's indicative of the time it was made in. Nowadays, you don't really have generic stuff. If you are old, I mean, as me, and you're on medication, you'll know the term generic from like that. It's basically um, less brand name version of a more popular brand name item. You know, uh, not to get too much information. If you have high cholesterol, instead of taking Lipitor, which is from a um, major pharmaceutical company and probably costs a lot of money, you could switch over to atorvastatin, which is the generic version of it, which is much cheaper and it saves you a lot of money. And most insurance companies would lead you toward that, depending on like what kind of you have. Um, that's pretty much the only modern day thing about generics there. But back when this was published, generic food items were very popular. They would be you go into like stores and you'd be able to see like a whole aisle, both sides taken up of nothing but cans with white labels on it, with black print telling you what it's on. No pictures, no advertising, no marketing, no nothing, and it'd be generic stuff. Like growing up poor, I had experience with it a lot. Um, the story behind it is like it was stuff that's made by the same people. Like if you get a generic version of pasta sauce, it's made in the same factory as the ragu by the ragu people, but they just put it out here just to help people out. It was usually much cheaper than the store the brand name brands. Um, and if you're on a budget, you'd be able to get that. It didn't last long. Maybe I don't know how long it really lasts, but I remember like it being gone. But like the closest thing we have to now in groceries is like the store brand, um, which is much cheaper than uh, the regular brand name item. Um, so they applied this thing about having like a big white thing to comic books, and hence the generic comic book was created. Um, no name, no cover, very rudimentary artwork. No real name characters inside. It's like basic bare bones kind of stuff. What you expect from a comic book that is a generic comic book. Um, the 80s were a wacky time. A lot of people were throwing stuff up on malls and see if they stuck. Some did, some didn't. You'll see these lists will be combined, like full with all those. But that was one of the most interesting ones then. Also on the same day, we had Phoenix #1. This was another direct to I think comic book stores item from Marvel, done on the heavier paper stock. It's basically the alternate ending of the Dark Phoenix saga, and told the story behind it. Basically, for those who don't know, the original intention was not Jean Grey dies at the end of the Dark Phoenix saga. If this spoils the actual storyline for you, I apologize. You should have read it a long time before then if you're a serious comic book collector. Don't mean to be mean. That sounds snarky. That sounds really bad. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I don't mean to be snarky. I'm just saying, like, it's one of the most seminal things on there. And even if you're new to the thing and just getting into it, you should probably already have that spoiled to you at least 50 times before I did. But if I did, I apologize. But since I did, at the end there, she commits suicide by turning one of the guns on herself in the blue area of the moon when he feels the Phoenix Force taking over her again. The original intention wasn't to have her kill herself or die. She was going to just have the X-Men had a battle between them and the Shi'ar, because Shi'ar was concerned about her killing the entire universe with her Phoenix powers. They had a fight. The X-Men lost, and the which were called the which were called the Shi'ar would eventually lobotomize Jean Grey, uh, take her mentality back to that of like her being a 5-year-old girl, and therefore taking away her ability to use the Phoenix Force. She'd still be alive, but she'd just be a simpleton who, just like picking up flowers by the side of a lake and stuff like this, and they'd probably go from there. Jim Shooter decided like during part of the Dark Phoenix storyline, she destroys the sun that you know destroys an inhabited planet and kills millions of people. And he said, no Marvel character should do that and not get some kind of punishment for that. So hence it was changed to being her killing herself. Um, this, but I think like it was kind of like changed after the fact. The actual original ending was already made, and it was just put in a strong box at the end. I could be wrong. Correct me if I'm wrong in the comments. Until you know future, and this is the future. They actually print the actual original story as it was intended to be um, made, and go through all that stuff, and also it gives you the splash page of what would happen if it went on. The next issue would be, uh, and in the back it has a round table between like Jim Shooter and Chris Claremont and Louise Jones and John Byrne and I think everybody else who was involved in the making of the issues, just to discuss the stuff going on there, which I thought was fascinating. It was like behind the scenes kind of thing. Um, you might be able to find this in certain like dollar bins. If you see it across there, it's a nice curio to pick up and read, especially if you're a big fan of the X-Men or the Dark Phoenix saga. Um, so now you know, and knowing's half the battle. January 17th, 1989. We have Mage #1. This is a series that was done by Matt Wagner. Matt Wagner, I think, is one of my favorite creators and stuff. I almost have a complete set of this. I haven't read all of it, but like I love everything he writes. He's most famous for the Grendel series. Grendel, I think, came before this, but this one was also done by Comico. Um, it's kind of like a take on the Arthurian legend, like the Legend of King Arthur, in present day. Instead of Excalibur, Mage has a glowing baseball bat. But it's also kind of semi-autobiographical about Wagner's life. And it had a couple different installments. It was like picked up about 20 years ago for Image and finally completed and stuff. I believe, unless he has another plans. But I just thought it was a fascinating kind of like series and stuff. This is one of the things I always wanted to get in and read, and I've read a little bit of it. And it's like really fascinating. This is one of the great things about this era is that you have independent comics like this, which allow creators to just go crazy and do stuff and follow their imagination and their id and whatnot. So that came out this month, and also Normal Man #1 came out. We already talked about Normal Man when we talked about his first appearance in Cerebus. It was a 12-issue miniseries, limited series, I should say, and um, again they have made a bunch of compilations of this. I'd recommend you checking out. I believe it might have been black and white, if I'm not mistaken. I could be wrong about that, but yeah, if you find it any place, if you find like a dollar bin, or you find like the a compilation at your bookstore, pick it up, give it a look. Um, Next up, another biggie, uh, released on the 24th of January 1984, Marvel Superheroes Secret Wars. This was like one of the first true multi-hero crossovers, and the crossovers that spilled over into the actual regular comic books. Um, if you don't know the story behind it, it's basically like, Mattel was coming up with a line of toys. They wanted to have a comic book series to tie into it. Uh, Jim Shooter came up with the idea of doing this, and the rest is history. Um, which is kind of unique because like certain like characters in the toy line were not in the mini series. There's the second wave I think had like Falcons and an Iceman kind of figure, and they were nowhere to be found in this one. But it's kind of interesting that that's where it came from. But it changed like the history of comic books from ever. It's like kind of this is like the comic book industry's Jaws. Before Jaws, there wasn't really a summer blockbuster. There's no interest. Summer was like a dead period. Many people thought for movies because everybody's out vacationing, they're spending time with their families, they're not going to movie theaters. And Jaws was proved, hey, if you have something really big enough and grand enough, they'll come in on vacation with their family members and see the movie. This is kind of like the kind of thing like this. This kind of proved to everybody, hey, we have a whole bunch of comic book heroes all in one issue together, finding a goal and having like the affect their other books, their actual regular books. You can make a lot of money from it, and we're dealing with it even to this very day. And after that is, I believe it was the very next week, the 31st, was Amazing Spider-Man 252, which everybody knows is, if I got the number right, I forgot to write it down, uh, the first appearance of the black suit Spider-Man picked up in um, Secret Wars, um, in his regular comic book, Amazing Spider-Man. Um, some people today might not realize like we didn't even know how he got the suit for another 7 months, um, but it appeared the week after the first issue started, because the way the superhero the miniseries was saying like the issues before all this, before the first issue, heroes are drawn to this big kind of arena thing in Central Park, and they're investigating, and they go in, and all of a sudden it disappears, and they're teleported to someplace else. The Avengers, Fantastic Four, Spider Man, like all of them are just like taken and zapped someplace else. Um, but in the actual Marvel, in the actual time of their actual comic books, it was only a month. The next issue opened with the big stadium reappearing and then popping out, um, with a whole new set of stuff and a whole new set of like powers and stuff like this. Some lasted, some didn't. But the most famous of them, obviously, of course, is Spider-Man's black suit, which eventually was turned out to be an alien symbiote attached to him and draining his life force, which eventually was taken off him and put onto Eddie Brock to become Venom. So, if you're a Venom completist, you might get the first appearance of Venom, and you could stick with the Amazing Spider-Man 300, or you could really go to deep dive to get this because this was probably his first appearance. And we didn't find out how he got the costume for, like I said, another 7 months, which boggles the mind. Next up, February 1984, which would be the 9th, February 9th, which would be Tales of the Teen Titans number 42. This is the start of the Judas Contract storyline. Um, New Teen Titans under Wolfman and Perez had a lot of great stories. But the main story, the big story, the most important story, the one I recommend everybody to read if they want to read like New Teen Titans, would be the Judas Contract. Simply put, it's the Teen Titans were joined by another teen-age hero called Terra, and for a lot of times it's like kind of like typical kind of like, hey, you're joining a team, typical kind of like comic book. Oh yeah, well you're doing this, is a misunderstanding like this. Until here, it's revealed that she was actually a spy working for Deathstroke, meant to satisfy the contract that Hive had out on the New Teen Titans. And over these 4 series, it's basically about how like she breaks down the team from within, and how like how the Titans are able to overcome it. And it's one of the I'm deliberately not trying to sell it, like, to tell you much about it, because this is one you should definitely go out and get by yourself and read. But it was one of the most important comic book stories of the time, and also of DC Comics, and also of New Teen Titans. All right, next up, we are into March 1984, and we are on to 3/13/1984, which Mike's Amazing World tells me is when the first issue of Zot was published. This was published by Eclipse Comics, and it was done by Scott McCloud. Um, it's for historical purposes. It's like, without this, we probably would never had him. He became a big scholar about comic books, with his understanding comic books, and reading comic books, and making comic books his line of trade paperbacks, which helped him to explain the comic book genre and everything to neophytes, which are still valuable today. They're still being sold today. But before he did all that, he created this like character called Zod, who was kind of like a sci-fi kind of hero. And again, 80s independent stuff, you have a room for a lot of big and like big ideas to be put out there, and a lot of chance actually going out there and see if you fall on your face or you fly. I forgot to mention at the beginning, Love and Rockets, one of the best independent series of all time, was up and running at this time, and kind of like inspired all these other people. But this was like Scott McCloud's like first foray in which way we made the name of comic books, and without this, he would never have the whole like understanding comics thing. Next up, we're going to go to 3/20, 1984, which again is another private, personal one for me. The first issue of Blue Devil. Um, this was one of the like I said in an earlier one, I think, when I did like the Avengers 227 one, I was drawn to new stuff, and as a novice, relatively young collector, um, if I saw a new issue and a new first issue, a new character, I felt like affinity towards it, like a deep connection to it. Um, and Blue Devil was one of these characters. It was a stuntman who accidentally fights a demon who thinks he's a real demon. He's wearing a demon costume. He's making a horror movie. He gets trapped inside the suit, and he decides to use the suit to fight crime, and eventually supernatural crime. He used to be like a demon hunter kind of thing. He was in a whole bunch of books. He's currently in the latest, most recent Zatanna miniseries, which I dug seeing him like that. But he also started here. I thought it was a really fun kind of like loose book, done by I think Dan Mishkin and Dan Cohn, I think, or Gary Cohn, um, and drawn by Paris Cullins. Paris Cullins had a really loose and fluid style, which I really dug, and this was like one of his first works in comic books. So yeah, this is one of my favorites going forward. I see the time on it. I'm trying to go through this as quickly as possible, because I think I'm going to have to break this down into 2 videos, because even I don't want to see 2 hours of me talking about stuff back at one time. Next up, in April of 1984, the first one up is the Superpowers toy line was introduced. Not really comic book stuff, but for me growing up as a comic book collector, it was one of the most awesome things ever. Granted, I think Mattel was coming out with the Marvel line, but the Marvel line was kind of like cheap, lack for a better term. Not really a lot of articulation, not a lot of stuff like this. They basically ran in there. Everybody had, Wolverine claws that you clipped on the back, and they're plastic and they got bent, and everybody had a shield, including Captain America, the only guy who should have a shield, but he had a shield that didn't have the concentric circles on it. I don't think it. I think it had the concentric circles and his face in the middle of it. I could be wrong, but it was done by people who didn't really respect the comic books or the figures or where they came from. Then you had the Superpower line, which was bloody awesome. I think it's one of the best toy lines ever made around comic book characters ever. I was not able to actually fully partake of it because, once again, like my finances were devoted to primarily comic books, secondarily G.I. Joe figures. So adding another figure line onto it would not be feasible. But these ones actually looked like the characters and were molded like characters. Like they weren't, the Marvel ones were all seemed like they came out of the same kind of mold. They all had the same body type. They all had the same kind of stance, whatever. This one had all different kind of stances and stuff like this. The Joker was skinny. You know, like the Aquaman had scales you could actually fill with your finger and stuff like this. And all of them had like kind of like an action figure. You pushed their legs together, and Superman would punch, or Wonder Woman would put her things up. So it was it's one of the best things ever. It was supported by like comic books that were actually included in the actual with the figures. It tells you like their origin and stuff like this. But also it had a miniseries done that was released later in the month by DC Comics, drawn by Jack Kirby, which is kind of like was set in the world featuring the characters who were made into the figures. Um, Man, as a kid, I was sold to constantly. It wasn't even funny. Like G.I. Joe cartoons, uh, superpowers, comic books. It was like like all trying to get my money off of me. Um, but I digress. Uh, Next up is Grimjack #1. This is a series I'm trying to collect now. It was First Comics. It's a kind of like a mercenary who like kind of like does a whole kind of weird kind of alternate history in different worlds and stuff like this. Uh, Really good. I've read a little bit of it. I haven't read all of it. Um, I'm trying to complete the set, but again, one of the things I'm going to include these on here to pound to the fact that, hey, you know, comic books have a long history of during this time of like just like trying weird stuff, and this just makes this era great. Uh, Next up is Crossfire, another independent comic book. It's a spinoff from the DNA Agents or DNA Agents, written by Mark Evanier. It involves like the assassin, you know, mercenary guy from that, who was dating a member of the DNA Agents at the time. Uh, and finally, that took place on the 24th of April. Finally, on April 26th was the Teen Titans annual Tales of New Teen Titans annual #3, which was the final installment of the Judas contract. And the reason I put the Judas contract on here twice is to massacre the name, as I did a couple seconds ago, and also to let you know, like sometimes during this period of time, like DC would make you get the annual if you really want to complete the story, which is both good and bad. Bad because you have to, instead of paying like 60 cents for it or 75 cents for it, you have to pay like $1.50 or whatever. But on a good standpoint, you get more bang for your buck. You get more story, more pages, more great George Perez artwork to do that. So, but like if you're looking to get this series to read, I don't know why you would, because there's an expensive issue like in the midst between these two issues that were the first appearance of Nightwing, or Dick Grayson as Nightwing, which is kind of expensive to read. But if you do decide to do that, just know the last thing is not in the actual release series. It is actually an annual. So you are now forewarned. Next up, May 1984. Starting on May 1st, we have Power Pack #1. Power Pack was a bunch of kid heroes who got magic suits that gave them superpowers from an alien that crashed in their backyard. It seems to get a lot mocked and ridiculed around this time, like by people now, because hey, it's kids with superpowers. Oh, how lame! Back when I was about the age of these kids, picking this up and stuff, I felt it was like a comic book series that actually spoke to me and characters I could identify with and stuff like this. And being a kid as a comic book collector, that was very important to me. I always will have a soft spot in my heart for Power Pack. I really would like to see it on the MCU. I think it might be perfect for adaptation into the big screen, but um, I don't know if that'll ever happen. Next up, same May 1st. And again, like I think this website might say put May 1st for something that happened in May, but they're not really sure. Because this one, I don't know if you can narrow it down when it was actually released, was but it's Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles #1. Unless you've been living like under a rock in some sort of desert region far away from anybody else, you should know who the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles are. Created by Kevin Eastman and Peter Laird, two guys who pulled their a couple loans here and a couple their savings accounts and income tax refunds, and created a property that made them millionaires. It became one of the most important character creations from the 80s to this point. Rivals, I say, almost Mickey Mouse in terms of like marketing and stuff like this. Not exactly, but it's as close as the 1980s would come to that. As you could tell, if you go through like a toy store or a bookstore or whatever, or a gaming store, you'll be able to see plethora of TMT items there. And it also kind of kicked out a black and white boom during this time, and they realized, hey, we could make something relatively cheap and make buku bucks off of it. Not realizing they didn't have the skill or talent of Laird or Eastman. But yeah, that's sorry for maybe another time. Next up is West Coast Avengers #1. This is a mini-series as a spin-off of the Avengers. Me being an Avengers fan, this is one of my favorite things. I was able to actually get an Avengers title for my very own that could start from #1. It lasted 4 issues, and after 4 issues, it was popular enough to get its own ongoing series, which ran for a couple of years, which had a number of good creators and bad creators involved in it. Next up is, let me go back, I missed it. I think it was like the 10th of May, New Teen Titans #1 came out. New Teen Titans #1 was a spin-off. It's kind of like a spin-off of the new, Tales of New Teen Titans. But basically, it's like in the 80s, like DC was taking their popular newsstand comic books and creating direct-only versions of it on higher quality Baxter paper, sold only to like the comic book stores. New Teen Titans was one, and in the same month, on the 24th, Legions of Superheroes was the second one. And these were the top two properties DC had at the time. So they're trying to get as much money as they can for the properties. What happened was they ran them both simultaneously, new stories in both. Like the Tales of the Legion of Superheroes became like the newsstand version of the Legion of Superheroes, and for a while they were running concurrently with individual stories, but eventually like about 6 or 7 months later, the newsstand comic book started reprinting the direct comic book stories at a later time. So basically, it was a little bit behind there, and eventually the newsstand ones were completely canceled. Not long after like the reprints started to take place, but the Baxter versions kept on going. And of course, like after a certain amount of time, it kind of kept on getting rebooted and rebooted and rebooted after that. But at the time, this was like kind of like a new kind of thing. Like, hey, crass commercialization. Hey, you like your new Teen Titans? Well, how'd you like them in big, glossy white paper that'll cost you extra money to buy? You like that, wouldn't you? And I did because I bought it. And next up on the 29th is Transformers #1. By this time, G.I. Joe was already popular for Marvel this time, and they still had the Hasbro license. So they tried to do the same thing they did for the G.I. Joe for Transformers. It didn't quite last as long as the G.I. Joe one, but it was a very interesting toy tie-in, especially when Spider-Man, a couple issues into the run, crossed over, which kind of like made like the Transformers part of the Marvel Universe. And then, doing the whole Wold Newton kind of thing. If you're not familiar with that, WOLDNEWTON. This starts approaching an hour. I won't go into that much detail now. If you want to know more, put in the comments. I'll try to cut in the comments. But I digress. Later on, when the Transformers crossed over with G.I. Joe, that means that G.I. Joe was also part of the Marvel Universe because of the connection to Spider-Man, even though nobody else really crossed over with them. So it's kind of like, you know, if you want to do your own fan fiction where Snake Eyes goes up against Wolverine, feel free to do this in this little, using this as justification. And finally, on the 31st of May of 1984 was Action Comics number 558. This is another personal one for me. It's not really a key. It doesn't really have anything historical importance, except for me, because like when I picked it up, it Superman, during one of the stories, I think it's only like for a couple pages, goes to this town in Pennsylvania. I forget the name of it in the comic book. It's given like a dummy name, but he goes there and it's a town that had a mine fire underneath underneath the town that's raging uncontrollably, and he goes in there and he fixes it. Uh, this town is based on a real life town not far away from where I grew up called Centralia, which really did have a underground mine fire. Unfortunately, we in the real world do not have an actual Superman who could go down there with his ice breath and put out the mine fire. So they had to let it burn, and they evacuated the entire town. The entire town had to be moved out. There might have been a couple of stragglers that didn't want to move out, and they say, "Okay, well, here you're on your own. No cops, no firemen, no ambulances coming in there. So if you want to take that risk, go right ahead." And everybody else was relocated someplace else. I think the fire is still burning underneath the town today. There's a, it's appeared in a couple other comic books and other media fiction already. But whenever I come there, I'm always taken back to actually, my growing up there and hearing the stories of it on the news. Next up, June 1984, starting on the 5th of June, Flaming Carrot #1. Flaming Carrot is another black and white comic book that came out featuring the absurdist hero Flaming Carrot. If you have never read Flaming Carrot, again, a lot of this stuff I'm going to recommend for you. He's weirdly funny. You have to have a weird sense of humor. You have to know going into that this is unique, weird, out there, gonzo, bizarre kind of stuff. But it's incredibly funny. But if you ever saw the movie Mystery Men with Greg Kinnear and Ben Stiller and Paul Reubens and William H. Macy, it was based on characters that first appeared in this comic book series. It's created by a crazy, deranged, incredibly intelligent, incredibly talented individual called Bob Burden. So, again, another historic character that first appeared during this period. Next up was a epic comic book, Six from Sirius. Six from Sirius was a sci-fi kind of book, but I want to talk more about it in the aspect of having epic comic books. Epic Comics was an offshoot, an imprint of Marvel Comics. It was kind of like their boutique, kind of like imprint. It was where they had the Epic Illustrated, I believe that's the name of it, comic book, which is a compilation that had really big names in it, like Bernie Wrightson, and I think Stephen King did an adaptation of his Lawnmower Man in the series there. But it's also had stuff where like it's more out there, esoteric, kind of like non-traditional superhero kind of comic books. There's going to be a couple here that I'm going to talk on that we're really interested in getting into. I want to get this at some point, but it existed and it was really cool. I'm going to leave that at that. Moving along, this is going to be over an hour. I'm sorry, guys. You don't have to watch it if you don't want to. If you watch it already, it shouldn't be that long. I'm already up to June, and I'll stop at October. Just bear with me. Next up, June 20th. It was Elementals #1, another Comico series which dealt with a whole bunch of superhero characters. This was another legendary comic book from the time, but also showed that you could use the independent world to actually have an alternate take on superheroes. Not everybody could be like Alan Moore and get a chance to work on the actual mainstream comic books, but if you want to make your own personal spin on the comic book genre, you could go to the independent store side and create your own characters and use them to deconstruct everything. And next up was another Marvel one, a miniseries Machine Man #1. I believe this might have been written by Tom DeFalco, but the main job was the art of Barry Windsor Smith. He did the covers. I think Herb Tripp did the insides of it, but each cover had like Barry Windsor Smith in it, and like it showed like a time lapse of like Machine Man being constructed, like and stuff like this, and like by the end he was the full thing like this. The miniseries took place in the far-flung future of 2020 and introduced the character of Iron Man 2020, which um, it showed a 2020 that was a whole lot different than the 2020 we lived through just 5 years ago. Nary a trace of pandemic at all in it, for one. But it was a very interesting kind of like weird kind of like mini series, and it's another good thing about this year I want to talk about bringing this up. Like even the majors, the main two, the big two, Marvel and DC, would have take a chance on like out there esoteric kind of miniseries just to run it up the flagpole, see if it salutes. Moving on to July of 1984, we're going to start at July 1st, which was Echoes of Future Past #1. This is the first comic book put out by Continuity Studios. If you've watched any of my haul videos, you'll know that this this place was it's a really interesting company, and I'm going to talk about more about this as we go on later. But this was the first thing. It was Neil Adams' studio in comic book form, and it helped build him as being kind of like a smaller independent publisher during this time. Later on in the month was on the 10th of July was Incredible Hulk #300. This, of course, is an anniversary issue. It probably doesn't get a lot of talk about being that big of a key. There's no first appearances in it and stuff like this. But for me as a kid, this was like the culmination of that. Once before Hulk went to Secret Wars, he had Banner's intelligence. He was smart, and he was becoming more accepted by the world because he's no longer Hulk smash, break, bone, whatever. He was able to have a conversation as a normal human being. However, when he came back from the Secret Wars, he was angrier, and he was more short-tempered and ill-tempered, and he was still keeping his intelligence, but he was snapping more, and he was like going on like a little bit crazier, slowly but slowly, issue by issue, over, and they did a little slow burn with it, and it culminated here. This is like full savage Hulk, and he's like destroying New York City, and almost every hero who's in New York City, like is in this issue. Spider-Man tries to stop him, it doesn't work. Power Man and Iron Fist try to stop him. Nobody, it doesn't work. The Avengers try to stop him. They only slow him down a little bit. Eventually, Doctor Strange comes in, and he his solution to do is to help his friend out so he doesn't get killed, or but to stop his destruction is to put him in a crossroads reality, a reality that had portals to other kind of planets and dimensions and stuff like that, where Hulk could go there and try to search for a place where he could actually fit in and live, and not have to worry about like being hunted and persecuted on Earth. And it started kind of like a sci-fi kind of segment for that. But I just like as a kid, Spider-Man's suit gets the biggest kind of like attention as the spin-off that's most effective from uh, the Secret Wars. I point to this one as being also very effective, especially as I was getting the Hulk at the time and just seeing it play out over there. I thought it was brilliant. I think it was Bill Mantlo who did the writing on it, um, and various artists. I think Jerry Talak maybe was on it. I could be wrong, but yeah, that for me was like another great kind of like series and a issue that should get more attention, but doesn't get the respect I think it deserves. Next up, August in 1984, as we start our second hour of this video. I'm sorry, guys, for hanging around. On 8/14/81, we have another miniseries. It's Kitty Pryde and Wolverine. I think last installment of this, if the timing is right, I talked about my experience with X-Men, and how my first issue of the Uncanny X-Men was 168, I believe, which was the Kitty Pryde Professor Xavier's joke focused issue. And I went in there about talking about how well the writing was, about how not to make her a Mary Sue, too powerful, too be able to do everything, too forefront kind of thing. Um, this miniseries kind of is the opposite of that. Uh, Essentially, she goes to Japan. I think she gets kidnapped, if I'm not mistaken, or gets involved in some kind of like ninja cult where they brainwash her to become like their assassin and teach her the ways of the ninja, like over the span of 2 weeks, and she becomes a full blown ninja. And Logan has to go over there and figure her out. Um, Having her be a ninja adds another dimension to her character, yes, but she's still a teenager, and being a teenage ninja, I was a teenage karate. I took karate when I was a teenager, and I knew there was no way I could actually be a ninja. It was hard enough to get to be an orange belt. But nonetheless, I digress. And another thing, maybe I'm a little cynical because, like, of all the artists who worked in the X Men at the time, the artist on this series, I believe, throughout the whole series was Al Milgrom. Al Milgrom, I love for being the editor in chief of not editor in chief, the editor of Marvel Fanfare. He'll always have a soft spot in my heart for that. But as an artist, I just did not dig his artwork. It was just like the style just didn't do well for me. And consider you had like John Romita Jr. and Paul Smith and like a whole bunch of other people who are like Dave Cockrum and great names dealing with X-Men characters, and you have Al Milgrom come in. Like, I don't know if like Jim Shooter just thought that he was like the bee's knees and he had a different opinion than me or anybody else, or he just wanted somebody who could do something quick and get it out with as quickly as possible. And Al Milgrom could do that because he's also doing Avengers at the same time he did this. But yeah, the artwork was kind of like not up to the X-Men standards. Not that I had really much experience with it at the time, but in my opinion, as a 12-year-old, and all 12-year-olds have really valid opinions. Um, Next up is August 10th was the Legion of Superheroes #4. This was the fourth issue of the Baxter series, and it features the death of Karate Kid. Um, Granted, I'm relatively new to the world of comic books here. Not big in the Legion, but I became a big fan of him in not short order. I wasn't really familiar with Karate Kid up to this point from when I started collecting it and reading comic books. He wasn't a big part of the thing, but um, I understood he was a big part of the past. And in this thing, he loses a battle, a hand-to-hand battle against them as a kid who kills him. And it was like my first experience with a major comic book death. So this is what it means for me. Like, this is a personal one more than a great history one. But this is like kind of like told me like this, and this is back at the time when death in comic books wasn't exactly as common as today. It seems like every time somebody wants to, you know, get a boost in comic book things, they do a death of issue. All right, so where were we? Next one is Secret Wars #8. This, of course, is the first appearance of the black costume. We find out how he got to the black costume, which I think by this point in the comic books he was already trying to get rid of, if I'm not mistaken. I think like the issue with him and his old and new costume wrestling over him already happened in Amazing Spider-Man. But I'm just trying to get through this. Next up, in September 1984, is 927 is Spanner's Galaxy. This is another. There's a lot of forgotten history series that came out that never really made it into actually being collected into trade paperbacks, or if they did, they're out of press. Or this is one of them. This was written by Nicola Cuti and who also did the artwork, the writing for E-Man, the series that the humorous kind of like first comics guy, and art by Tom Mandrake, who went on to do the Spectre and a whole bunch of other like really atmospheric kind of horror books and stuff like that. It's kind of like it's very Star Wars inspired. It's about this farm boy who grows up and is accused of a crime and becomes a rebel and has to fight his way across the galaxy trying to save his life with this, like try to keep alive and try to clear his name. When he has this very special, like weapon that you have to have special training to use. See the comparison. Um, it's kind of like a boomerang, kind of like axe kind of thing. Um, I remember picking this up and I loved it. I haven't read it since then because it's hard to find. It's not on the DC Unlimited. It's not on DC. Um, like it's not on like out. You can't find a trade paperback for it. It hasn't been collected as far as I could tell. Um, People complain about the bootlegging of comic books, and I agree with it 100%. You should buy comic books somehow because this way the creator gets paid. But there's certain aspects where you can't buy the comic book, so therefore and forthwith, it's I can understand that. That's a discretion. Hot take. Talk to me about that in the comments if you want to. But however, this one was a very good one, a 6 issues miniseries, and it was set up for like having future ones. I don't know if it did very well. It didn't well enough to actually finish its series out, which we'll talk about later. About certain series don't get that privilege, but I thought it was very good. But it's also to point out that yeah, this time is a good time for experimentation in comic books and in from the majors all the way down to the minors, but not everyone actually has escaped the minefield of memory intact. So now we're going to go into now October, and we're finally going to call the end of this massive, incredibly long System of a Down. Done. And I will do the next year, 1984 to 1985, in a separate part 2 of this, which is good because now I have more content and I don't have to actually break it down. Lucky me. So, October 1984. First up, 10/9/1984, the first issue of Void Indigo was published. Remember when I was telling you about sometimes like limited series do not always make it to the finish line intact? This is one of them. This started off as a graphic novel, and then it was going to be adapted into a 6-issue miniseries. It's written by Steve Gerber, and I think the art was by Val Merrick, I believe so. I think the team that worked on that created Howard the Duck. So they were doing this, and it's about an alien coming to Earth and trying to figure out where he is and what he stands for. However, it was incredibly violent for the time. It got very criticism for the amount of violence in it, and it was not terribly well reviewed. It was kind of lambasted by critics, and the pre-orders for the second issue went down so far that Marvel, I believe this is an Epic comic, decided, nah, I think we're done. We've had enough of we had enough being in the Void Indigo business. Yeah, we're done. The storyline never finished. It was like leave that particularly on a cliffhanger, if I'm not mistaken. But it was eventually like kind of like it didn't allow to finish the story it was telling in the first 2 issues. Eventually, like I think Steve Gerber's notes was released online, and people were able to find out like where he was intending to take it if it actually ever made it out all that way. But this is like one of the few cases where a miniseries didn't make it to the end. Another one was Sonic Disruptors. It's from DC Comics. So I think it was a Mike Baron, if I'm not mistaken. It could be him, comic book. It only made it 7 out of 12 issues and was cut off and because of bad sales. So just remember, if you want to catch a miniseries, make sure you start buying early and often because it might not make it there to the end. And finally, for this segment, we have DC Sampler number 3. DC Sampler was a really cool book. It was a free book that was released to comic book stores and given out to people. Basically, it's kind of like a regular comic book. It's like the size of a regular comic book, but it had like 2 pages devoted to every comic book series that was being published by DC Comics at the time. Usually, like it's a little kind of like artwork, special artwork done by the actual creative team who's on there. So you have like Marv Wolfman and George Perez on there telling where exactly the new Teen Titans are going to go in the future for next year or whatever. And it's really cool to see that on its own. It's kind of like nice as curio to see like it's a piece of advertising. So if you like comic book advertising, this is for you. However, this one in particular has a special honor. If you remember going back to my Girlfriend's Guide to Comic Books based on keys, comic book keys, I told you about how there's some sliding keys. Like there's stuff that everybody used to think was the first appearance of stuff, and then out of nowhere, certainly people say like, "Hey, how about this one? This should be a key too because I have it in my collection. I want to make money from it." This is one of those. During the write-up on the Saga Swamp Thing, there is a preview of the next couple issues of it, and this was before issue 37, so they were covering that too. And as everybody knows, I think issue 37, if I get the number right, I hope I got it right, it was the first appearance of John Constantine, a very popular comic book character in DC and Vertigo. You might know him if you don't know comic books from TV series and the Keanu Reeves movie that's going to get a sequel. He was also in he had his own TV series on NBC, and he was also in the Legends of Tomorrow series. But he appears in one of the panels in the preview for like he doesn't even get named. He doesn't say a line of dialogue. He doesn't do anything. He's just standing there. But people have come to consider this as being his first appearance, and so you could get 1 and 2 of this mad sheep. You could probably find it in $80 bin or whatever. This one you're going to have to pay some money for. I think I picked up mine. I picked all 3 of them up for $15, and that's basically for this one. About a year or 2 ago. But if you really want to, if you consider like one guy just appearing in the background of a panel of a preview issue as a first appearance, and you're a fan of John Constantine, you might want to pick this up. All right, I'm going to cut this off here. I'm going to maybe try to trim this to get underneath an hour, but I will probably immediately jump into my second year of my golden age, my 13th year on Earth, with the comic books that came out then. Some big ones. Certain comic book companies were going through crises. Certain men who are miracles would come to Eclipse from a stint over in England. If you could figure those out, then you'll know what to expect coming up. Until then, if you made it all the way through, this is a long one. I thank you. I appreciate that. If you did, you must have liked it. So if you could do a thumbs up, and if you want to see more of this, that's also a good indication. If you want to subscribe. If you have been playing along with the lists on Mike's Amazing World, and there's something I might have missed, or something that resonated with you during this time that you'd like to talk about, please, by all means, put in the comments. We could have a conversation about it. But next week, we go with part 2 of this, which will cover from 1984 into 1985. Until then, keep on collecting.